Ladies and gentlemen, in researching today's topic, which is whether the European Union should have an army, I came upon an article that was asking the very same question. It was an article on the website of the Institute for Economic Affairs, and it was written by Darren Grimes, and I thought the name sounded familiar. And then, I worked out who it was. He was a student who was given a suspicious amount of money to start a pro-Brexit group in the run-up to the 2016 referendum. Referendum, of course, on Britain's membership in the European Union. Grimes was given £600,000. A man in his early 20s being given more than £500,000 was a flagrant violation of electoral law and allowed vote leave to go over the allocated spending by quite a significant margin. So I was thinking to myself, an article about Europe written by a Brexiter, one who's had a run-in with the law. That's not dodgy at all, is it? It's a bit like asking Osama bin Laden for his favorite Spice Girl. Completely pointless. The good news is I found ample material on more respectable websites. The EU army is something that I've always liked the sound of anyway. But the more I researched this, the more I realized that the cons significantly outweigh the pros. So let's get into it. What are the pros of having a European army? Well, the first, and I think the most blatant reason, at least in my opinion, is the current geopolitical context. The United States is retreating on all fronts, it seems. Europe no longer has the familiar shawl of NATO protecting it from forces coming from the east or from elsewhere. Donald Trump even went as far as to call NATO obsolete, and now doesn't want America to respect its commitment to NATO. Under Trump, America seems to be very much going through a new isolationism. What's quite alarming is that America itself may be closer to Moscow than it is to Brussels. Did I say Washington is closer to Moscow than it is to Brussels, excuse me. And that is because the Russian threat is becoming graver and graver. Russia has already been responsible for invasions of Georgian and Ukrainian land over the last dozen years. Russian war games are getting increasingly threatening. In 2018, over 300,000 Russian military personnel participated in war games. When asked about this, the Russian Ministry of Defense said that the numbers were justified by the aggressive and unfriendly attitude of some towards Russia. Quite. Even more alarmingly, in 2016, American and Russian planes had near collisions on an almost weekly basis. This, to many experts in the field, looked like aggressive posturing from the Russian bear. A European army may also help protect Europe's borders and, frankly, protect her from outside influence. All we have to do is look back to my introduction to see that elections and the democratic process can be tampered with by outside forces. The Kremlin has been accused of financing anti-EU and anti-democratic campaigns. Trolls and bots abound on social media. I mentioned Darren Grimes, but I could have just as easily talked about another famous Brexiter, Aaron Brooks, who's accused of receiving many of his millions from Russia. Anyway, that is the rather long-winded first reason as to why we could potentially have an EU army. The second is that Europe, and the European Union more specifically, has the population to be a superpower, even without Britain. The EU still has a population of 446 million. That is more than America's 328 and more than Russia's 144 million. A third reason is that some of the most successful and profitable, for lack of a better word, arms manufacturers are based in the European Union. In fact, out of the top 15 biggest arms companies in the world, 5 are in the EU. They include BAE systems and EADS, as well as the Italian Finmeccanica. That's a FIM plus Mechanica. Normally, their success would have us hanging our heads in shame, as of course their weapons end up all over the world in conflicts everywhere. At least here, their ingenuity, to call it that, could be used for a more noble purpose. Another reason, I think, for having an EU army would be to help implement the EU's aid policies and humanitarian policies. The EU could, for example, go to developing countries and help them fight terror, fight drug cartels, or fight warlords. Another argument in favor, and the last one, is the fact that France and Germany already have an embryonic agreement on a joint military cooperation. This is happening outside of the European Union's remit, but they signed a deal in January 2019 calling for common military culture. Bit vague. So those are the pros. Are you ready for the cons? There are quite a few. The first is that the EU member states are so divergent in their views of the European Union that it'd be difficult to bridge all those gaps. In fact, bridging those differences may indeed be a bridge too far. Some countries see the EU as more of a political project, others as more of an economic project. And the Brexit referendum didn't just show us that, it also showed that some countries really do have a problem with sovereignty being taken away from them, even if perhaps they exaggerate on quite how much sovereignty is taken away. But one can imagine that these countries would not react well to a European army. A second problem with an EU army is that the EU has, frankly, divergent geopolitical interests. Some countries are terrified of Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Sweden. Other European countries are doing what they want and sending troops overseas almost willy-nilly. We can think of the countries who followed America into Iraq in 2003, the many countries who joined the US in Afghanistan in 2001, or indeed the French who have troops stationed in Mali and Chad and have had them there for quite a long time. Of course, the cherry on top would be Libya, where many European powers are involved, not all of them on the same side. A third reason against an EU army is that too many compromises would be needed to get everyone on board. And perhaps what would come out of this long, drawn-out negotiating process would simply be a watered-down army, one that wouldn't really have the power to do much. Another reason against having such an army is more of a thought experiment, or to put it better, an existential question. Do we really want to have all this power? Didn't we learn our lesson from colonialism? It's easy to say we're sending troops overseas, we're going to help them fight terror, they're going there for humanitarian purposes, they're there to help build bridges and develop a country's infrastructure. That can quickly escalate into tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of thousands of troops. This can escalate into massive deaths and even mass civilian deaths. And remember, even just wars come at a massive cost, especially for civilians. Another argument against the EU having an army is the frank impracticality of it. The EU institutions seem to be weaker nowadays. An army would need a centralized command, chiefs of staff able to react quickly to threats. The EU is moving away from decentralization. The Commission is less powerful than it was before. Now, supposedly, power is shared more. It is more representative. The Parliament has a bigger role. How can we reconcile these two movements going in opposite directions? Another problem, and the final one, I promise, with having an EU army is that certain EU countries are developing rather worrying authoritarian tendencies. We can talk about the Le Pen clan in France, the Rassemblement National. We can talk about Salvini in Italy and his league. We can talk about Vox in Spain. Or, of course, we can talk about European member states where citizens are already being deprived of basic freedoms. I'm talking about Hungary, of course, and its Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. I wouldn't trust that man with a toy gun, much less a real one, much less an array of cannons or an entire army. So what can we say in conclusion? I think we've gathered that an EU army would be a rather difficult undertaking. It would take a long time. Many European laws and institutions would have to be amended. All of these laws would then need to be transposed into national legislation, and that of 27 member states. Maybe it would be best to see where this Franco-German experiment goes. After all, reports say that other Western European countries, and the Benelux especially, are interested in such an agreement. Maybe we should emulate the coal and steel agreement. It started small, proved its worth, showed that it was pretty much indispensable, and other countries jumped on the bandwagon. Perhaps this army should do the same thing and follow the same course. That said, even if the perfect EU army, whatever that is, were to magically appear tomorrow morning, we still have to ask the question, do we really want this power? Power, after all, is a dangerous thing. And no matter what people tell you, every sword is double-edged. Thank you.